Hi everyone, and welcome to the Social Mobility Commission's Employer Masterclass, and today we're going to be talking about accents in the workplace. I am Paula Kemp. I'm Head of Employer Engagement here at the SMC, and I'm delighted to be joined by two extinguished guests today to talk about this subject. Just before we get started, if you could remain on mute, you can use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and we will have time at the end to ask our panelists and our speakers those questions as well. The webinar, as you've heard, is recorded, and closed captions are available for colleagues who require them. Just to give you a bit of an outline of today's session, so we've got Professor Devani Sharma from Queen Mary University London, who is going to be talking about speaking up, accents and social mobility at the first part, based on some research that she's done and work that she's done with accent bias in Britain. And then joining us a bit later on in conversation is Antoinette Wilcox from Fleischmann UK, and we'll make that introduction when that comes. So I'll be asking them some questions, and then of course we would welcome opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So you can see that there's a Q&A function along your taskbar, so please do put any questions you have in there. And then we'll be rounding up with some what's next and the resources and future events. So if I could just make those introductions. So as I say, we're joined by Professor Devani Sharma from Queen Mary University London. She's a professor of social linguistics, and her research is on new English dialects, inter-ethnic contact, bilingualism, accent variation and language chain. And in addition to co-authoring the Sutton Trust research report that I mentioned earlier, the Speaking Up, Accents and Social Mobility, her recent research includes 50 years of British accent bias and perceptions of professional competence in England, and she'll be talking a lot more about that as part of her presentation. She's part of the team behind Accent Bias in Britain project, which provides research-led information on current attitudes to accents in Britain and reviewing the role that this unconscious accent bias plays within the workplace, which I'm sure you're all keen to find out with the amount of people we've got online today and also who had registered for more information. So welcome, Devani. It's great to have you here. If you'd like to start and share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paula. I hope people can see that, and please do interrupt if there's any problem with the slides or with hearing me. But thank you so much to Paula and the team for the invitation to join you today. I'm really interested to hear your perspectives as well. I'm going to just give you a little context to our work, and then quite briefly review what we've done and some of the recommendations that we share in different sectors. So this is a project that we started about 6 years ago, and we were inspired by an older report by the Social Mobility Commission when we first proposed this research, which was the 2015 report mentioned here, that looked not at accent, but it looked at non-educational barriers to elite professions. So implicit effects in recruiting, for instance, where individuals might unconsciously or implicitly recruit in their own image, or where notions like talent and polish might be associated with middle-class behavior more than with skills and competence. And in fact, towards the end of the first round of work we were doing, a more recent Social Mobility Commission report came out, work by Sam Friedman, that also fits very closely with what I'll be talking about. And in our work, we are interested in these general issues with social mobility, but we're specifically interested in the role of accent in the perpetuation of these kinds of implicit biases. So our team brings together linguists and social psychologists and lawyers as well, because we looked at law as a particular sector as a focus. The Social Mobility Commission was on our advisory board for this work. And today I'm going to talk very generally about this ongoing project work, which is composed of many different studies that we've done. So I'll just talk briefly about what the problem is that we're focusing on when we talk about accent bias, what sort of evidence we look for, and what we might be able to do about it. So to begin with, when we talk about what we mean by accent bias, it's good to clarify the terms we're using. So when we say accent, we often hear people saying, I don't have an accent, but everybody has an accent. Some are more marked or noticeable in certain contexts than others. And importantly, it's also good to establish that everyone has bias. It's not just bad people that have bias. We all need to rely on shortcuts to process complex information. So you're hearing my voice and you're using shortcuts to be able to process my speech. So accents will always trigger social stereotypes for all of us. We'll have some association. It might be positive or negative. That's very hard to avoid. Accent discrimination is when those associations are relied upon to judge independent skills or competence. I'm going to use accent bias today more in the sense of discrimination, so the reliance on stereotypes for unrelated judgments. In the UK, it's well known that accent has organized British society for a very long time. We can see this quote from Charlene White, the first Black woman to present ITV News at 10, where she said about herself, I don't have the South London accent anymore because my parents sent me to elocution lessons from the age of 9. I guess they had foresight. So you see both the established role of accent in organizing society and the full participation of people in eliminating certain accents, feeling a need to do that to get ahead. And we see evidence of self-modification in a number of professions as well. So just briefly, before I go on to what kinds of evidence we look for, a comment on the legal status of accent specifically. Of course, it's not itself a protected characteristic, but crucially, accent signals a lot of protected characteristics and other characteristics. So it can signal ethnicity, gender, age, social class in parentheses here, because class itself is not a protected characteristic currently. So the important point to bear in mind is when we talk about accent bias, we're not just adding yet another unrelated form of bias to the list that we are concerned about. It's a signal for those social categories that we try and avoid. And interestingly, the awareness of how much we rely on accent to judge social groups is relatively low. There's a lot of awareness these days. This event is an example, a concern and awareness, but it's still much lower than awareness of racial bias or the problems of gender-based bias. People are still quite comfortable expressing bias against specific social groups through accent specifically. So we're in an interesting space in terms of addressing the problem. And in a way, there's a positive here, which is there's some potential to address it with very simple information and interventions. So when we look into a problem like this, we don't want to assume that it is prevalent everywhere and that it is actually impeding social mobility. We want to check for evidence. And I'll show you a couple of findings in our research. We have quite a few different studies. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a couple of headlines with you to give you an idea of the kind of data we look at. There might be a fair bit on the slides, and I'll just highlight a few things. So sorry to go through it a little quickly. So when we started doing a series of studies, we had a general question and a more specific one. The general one was just what are attitudes to accents currently and have they changed? There hadn't been a big study for a long time in the UK, but we were specifically interested in consequences for fair access, specifically to elite professions. Do these kinds of biases influence potential employer judgments? So just to give you an example, is an underrepresented accent heard as less qualified for a law position, for instance, in a corporate law firm, even if the candidate gave exactly the same answer. And working with lawyers at the beginning of our project, we did find that some of them would say, I do think I make snap judgments, that a posh accent might be more intelligent, more reliable. But a number of people also said they felt it was changing. So a couple of quick observations, starting with the simplest kind of data, which is just a survey of how people would rate the prestige of different accent labels. So here they're not listening to the voices of people. You can see we replicated a study from 50 years ago, and we had many more accents, but there were just 14 in the survey 50 years ago. And you can see that received pronunciation, which is the standard variety, is always ranked the highest. Interestingly, a non-native accent, French, is quite highly ranked in general. And then what we call national standard accents. And at the bottom of the ranking, we see ethnic minority and working class, industrial town type of accents. So the ranking has not changed very much. You see a little bit of a flattening with the blue line. So we see a very established hierarchy of accent prestige in the UK that hasn't disappeared. But this doesn't tell us too much about individual attitudes. People are just able to report back what they know is the social situation. So we tend to go further with our work and see how people react to the voices of someone who's in a job interview. So a mock job interview candidate giving responses in a job interview. I won't go into the details of how we design these studies. They're run with very large numbers of participants around the UK. And this allows us to have a fairly realistic task where listeners hear different interview questions and different people responding, and they just judge their competence for the job. We don't ask them if they like the accent or anything about the voice. But the design allows us to compare what responses were given for this exactly the same question and response. So in the results I'll talk about, we've controlled everything. The response itself is identical, only the accent is different. The accents that we looked at in more detail in this way include received pronunciation, the standard accent. You can hear it here.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
This is just a short extract. The responses were 30 seconds long. And I'll let you hear the others just briefly. This is a middle-class Northern accent.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Working class Northern.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
And then two working class London accents, one more associated with white speakers and one that tends to be associated with multi-ethnic groups, but in our case, they're both Black speakers.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
And the last one is multicultural London English.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Okay, so I'll just briefly show you some findings that we report on when we compare these voices giving exactly the same answers in interview. And the first thing that I'll show you is that younger listeners didn't make significant differences by accent in how competent the person would be for a job at a law firm. But from around middle age, age 45 onwards, we see a significant downgrading of the working class London voices, both the white speakers and the Black speakers. There was more bias of this kind above the age of 45, also among Southern England listeners and in higher social classes. It looks like it's good news because younger people don't have the bias, but actually what we find is it's very much also an effect of aging, that as people get older, they get more normative or standard oriented in their judgments. We also saw a much bigger effect of how strong the accent was for Black speakers, which is concerning because it's an intersectional effect, that there's more risk for a Black applicant to have a strong accent than, for instance, a white Northern applicant. But we also did further studies in law firms, and we found that with a harder task, lawyers didn't act on these biases, which gives us an opening for interventions because we show that you can set these aside with training and with task focus. Just briefly, a couple of positives. We found that we looked at answers, job interview responses that required expert knowledge, that were technical legal questions, and some that didn't require it, like tell us when you led a team well. And what we found was, regardless of accent, speakers get a boost when they are using expert knowledge in their answers. And also, not presented here, that when they spoke confidently, it was a much bigger factor than their accent. These are quite important positives that we use when we work with applicants from underrepresented backgrounds, where we say, rather than mumbling because you're self-conscious of your accent, which is very, very common, and has the kind of opposite effect to what the candidate wants. It makes people less positive because of lack of confidence. People should focus on knowing their stuff, knowing their expert knowledge, and being confident. So we have evidence that these can displace accent-based listening. So just to give a bigger picture, so far I've just talked about interview context and recruiting, but throughout the career path, there can be language-linked discrimination. So there's evidence that names alone can have an adverse effect on certain groups, even before you get to the stage of interview. We've just talked about interview context, where there can be greater risk for certain speakers. You can also end up having less feedback from the interviewer, which can subtly undermine certain candidates. But most importantly, even after the interview, and I'll show you a little evidence of this, a person may make it through the interview. As we saw, lawyers can actually suppress these forms of bias, but these kinds of biases can also persist in the workplace. So you might feel isolated from colleagues. You might even self-exclude from senior positions. Just briefly, and I'll then wrap up with a few comments on how we what we suggest as solutions, practical solutions. Just one final detail about our research. As Paula mentioned, we published a report with the Sutton Trust last year, where we looked at the other side of the story. So everything we did initially was about listeners and how they judge accents. What we wanted to do with the Sutton Trust was look at speakers' experiences and whether those match what we were finding. So a couple of main points from that work. First of all, we found across the board for different kinds of survey questions that university was the peak of anxiety, because this is where people are entering a much more mixed social world. They're often being mimicked, or, you know, a lot of them report on being mocked for their accents in a banter kind of way, but it makes them feel a lower sense of belonging. And they're also trying to enter their career. So university is a point of anxiety in terms of accent. And we find a number of other effects in this work for speakers of accents. One is, here you can see that Northern speakers, almost half of Northern speakers had the experience as early career employees of having their accent singled out in some way. The South, in fact, that 20% is almost all working class Londoners, an effect we saw earlier. So aside from that, there's almost no such experience for Southern speakers. We even find among senior managers a social class effect, where there's much higher experience of being mocked or singled out for voice, for accent, among lower socioeconomic groups, even when senior. I'm just showing you a little bit of what people say, the qualitative side of their comments. You see problems with sense of belonging. You see the difficulty of suppressing accent, which I'll come back to in a minute, the need to act white, people explicitly saying shame about the voice when someone didn't get a promotion. And importantly, if you look at the last one, being seen as a troublemaker if you mention that you feel you're being singled out because of accent. We also saw a lot of evidence that students with underrepresented accents didn't hear their accents in their careers, so they felt less of a good fit, which obviously also has implications for their career path. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes and then stop showing you some of the solutions we suggest and recommendations that we suggest based on the work we've done. So the first is that we have some interactive tutorials online. We try and keep these short and interactive. You can do listening tasks. These are on our website and free for teams to use. We've also embedded resources and brief advice in the Social Mobility Commission's Professional Services Toolkit. But we also tested interventions. So one thing that we felt strongly was we don't want to propose interventions that don't actually work because people's time is limited. As I said, we also didn't want to say accent bias exists if it's not seeming to have an effect, but we find probably does have a role, which is a concern. But then we wanted to test whether interventions work. So we tried a number of different interventions. I won't go into the details. We discussed these on our website. And the simplest one was the one that had the most effect in reducing accent-based differences in recruiters' reactions to mock job interview candidates. And this was very simple. It was just this gray text, which was a reminder that sometimes people rate candidates with a standard accent more favorably, and the focus should really be on knowledge and skills, not having that particular accent. Just reminding people of that reduced the level of difference in how people saying identical responses were rated according to accents, basically reduced accent bias. This finding is notable. We were interested that there was an effect because in the research, we now find in psychology and management research that gender and unconscious bias training for gender and race doesn't always work anymore. And it might be because that message is saturated and people might even get annoyed to be reminded. But the fact that we did find a positive effect of reminding people not to do this suggests, and this is very strongly confirmed in our conversations with employers, that people are not very aware of how much they rely on accent as cues for all kinds of skills and abilities. So our interpretation is they really were setting aside accent and listening to what the person was saying. So this is a real positive for us because where other unconscious bias training may not be that effective, accent is a little new for people to realize, that they may be over-relying on it, so it can be useful to use. But it is always worth noting that unconscious bias training does not eliminate biases. It just makes you aware of your biases. Many of us have the biases that I've presented today. The reason we have them is we haven't heard other kinds of accents in elite professional roles, MPs, judges. And so the only way that those underlying biases will reduce is through lifelong diverse exposure, hearing those voices in diverse contexts. A good example is that gender, that's happened a lot with gender. People are not surprised to see women in the workplace, but those biases got displaced, not by unconscious bias training, but by change in the real world. So this is my final slide, I think. I just wanted to comment on a related point to what I was just talking about. You could say, well, an easy fix is just to expect people to code switch to a standard accent at work. And it's very, very common to do that. And we would never say that people shouldn't do that. It's a personal choice and all of us accommodate to each other. It's very natural. It's a human thing to do. But we do take issue with the expectation that people should do it. People may choose to. There's a lot of discrimination out there and it can protect you from that. But expecting people to do it, for an employer to expect that to be the norm, has a number of problems. One is it removes other voices from, in this case, elite workplaces. So a Southern white middle-class norm would persist and we won't have that exposure to other voices, so the bias doesn't change. The surprise element of hearing someone with a different accent doesn't change. And people can't be their whole self, their authentic self at work, which is something we could come back to. We've had a lot of people say that there is pressure in performing a person that's not quite yourself. Also, not everyone has the aptitude to change their accent significantly. Some people are very good at it and some aren't. You can also get isolated from your community, shifting away from your voice. And of course, the pressure would be unequal only on certain groups. And accent is actually the hardest thing to change for physiological reasons, and often the least necessary to change for work, whereas you might need to learn special lexicon or be able to make a good argument. Accent is often not needed, doesn't need to be a particular accent for work. So just in conclusion, when we look at leveling the field, we have a number of positive ways forward. For speakers, we showed evidence that confidence and competence, expert knowledge reduces bias in listeners. It makes them focus on what you're saying. And for listeners, we simply encourage listen to what is said, not how it's being said, recognize how much you rely on accent, and in the kind of mobile world we live in, expect difference rather than the traditional expectation of a single standard accent. So this is just a summary. Accent bias exists. It does lead to unequal outcomes. It places an added burden on certain groups, but it can be addressed quite easily through awareness raising. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much, Devani. I loved it. Everything you were saying, I was thinking about, you know, my own experiences, but obviously experiences I've heard from others as well. So I think it ties in very nicely with some of the questions we've got and some of the questions that are appearing in the Q&A. So that was great. Thank you. So I'm going to invite Antoinette Wilcox to join us now. So she's going to join us on the panel. She's Director and UK Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for Fleishman Hillard, UK. They are a global PR agency, and she's on the management board for the UK agency and a counsellor in the London Mosaic practice, which is a team dedicated to providing DE&I communications advice to clients. She's responsible for developing and delivering the London strategy, and most recently, in collaboration with Creative Access, the team launched The Language of Discrimination. So it was a report exploring the issue of accent bias in creative industries, in specifically in that industry. Prior to joining the team, Antoinette at Fleishman Hillard, Antoinette spent over 10 years advising professional service organisations on their PR and reputation management, and transitioned into a role as a D&I consultant at the start of 2020 in response to the increasing need for diversity and inclusion professionals within strategic communications experience. And I think language and accents all ties in really with the role you now perform. So thank you for joining us today. We're really pleased to be speaking to you, and in particular to find out a bit more about the recent report, The Language of Discrimination. So I just wondered, could you kind of share with us a bit of information about how this research came about, and then what you found and how it ties in with what we've heard from Devani?
Sure, and thank you for the intro, Paula, and thank you also, Devani, for your presentation. I know your research, but I still find it so fascinating to hear you talk about it. So as you said, Paula, we recently launched the Language of Discrimination report. So the research was spearheaded by the socio-economic subgroup of our DE&I steering committee. So the group operates as somewhere between an employee resource group and an affinity group. They operate quite independently. They run their own agenda, priorities, their own budget. And of course, we're a PR agency. So language and communication is really central to our product and to the skill set of our people. And so when thinking about really relevant and pertinent DE&I topics, this seemed like quite a natural fit in terms of an issue to explore. So the team partnered with Creative Access, which is a social enterprise that aims to provide access and opportunities to the creative industries from people who are from underrepresented communities. And we collaborated with Creative Access to ask their Creative Access community a series of questions relating to accent bias, but importantly to compare the responses from the Creative Access community to the general population to see if the issues around accent bias are more pronounced within the creative industries. And ultimately, across most areas, we found that they are. And lots of the core findings, unsurprisingly, very much echo what Devani covered. We found that the majority, I think nearly 90% of respondents from the Creative Access community felt that they'd been prematurely or subconsciously judged by others because of their accent. I think it was over a third, around 35%, reported they'd been told to change their accent at work when talking to clients. And a massive proportion, over 80%, reported that they felt the need to code switch at work. And I know Devani touched on that, and it's such an important issue and such a, in many ways, startling number, because as Devani said, it's people's choice in terms of how they show up at work. It becomes problematic when you feel that you have to code switch to get on at work, particularly because we know about the impact that code switching can have on somebody's ability to show up authentically and perform their best at work.
I've just realised I'm on mute. Sorry. We're going to come on to talk about how you, what's the impact have been on the research a few months on now. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I think it's quite interesting that what you say in terms of the creative industry, because obviously we saw from Davani's that Charlene White, who's in the creative industry, as a newsreader, felt that she needed, that's why she's got on, and she had kind of code switched very early on. Through her parents, so that's quite interesting. It's been going on for a number of years. Davani, you've given us such a comprehensive explanation of accent bias in the workforce, and it feels it's so obvious that it's a problem affecting a huge percentage of the population. But in my experience, there's been much less focus on accent bias compared to other bias in the workplace, despite its prevalence. So what tips would you give to someone to help them to identify whether their organisation suffers, if that's the right word, from accent bias, and what steps they can take to address it?
Yes, sure. It's been interesting because we've done a lot of workshops in different sectors, so in government departments, but also a lot of corporate social mobility networks. And it can be a little bit hard to figure that out. I think what Fleischman Hiller did was amazing. It was one of the best, most comprehensive explorations I saw, where you actually do a survey and ask people, what's your experience been? So one possibility is just in something like staff surveys to have just a mention of accent, whether people feel that there's pressure to not really be themselves. We had a lot of senior managers saying that in their early career, they put themselves under pressure to not have their home voice at work, but that now they don't really do that anymore, and they wish they had lightened up earlier. So I think another possibility, if not a survey, is just occasional conversations about people's experiences with it. As I said at the beginning, I think it's important not to assume it's a big problem, because there are many workplaces that are very progressive, diverse, liberal, and so I don't think I think it's changing very fast. So I don't think employers should assume that it's the major problem at work. But I think it's something that's so naturalized to us. We're always immersed in language. In the UK, we're immersed in a prestige system that not all countries have. It's very, very long-standing in this country. So I think we can be a bit in the water and not notice that it's creating discomfort for some people. One thing that I found very interesting that came up in a discussion was that in staff support services, like mental health support at workplaces, the problem of not being able to be yourself is not really an element, so it's not really, but a couple of people said, actually, I felt so stressed in this line of work that I left, because it didn't even seem like a thing that the employer worried about. So it could also be that in staff support, there's a mention of, if you feel pressure a lot of the time just to be a certain way that's not comfortable, that you should be able to raise it, so just a mention of it. But yeah, it can be hard to know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting what you say about the managers who had changed and now feel like they no longer have a home and work accent, so they feel like they can bring their own accent to work, that wish they'd have done it years earlier. But I think some of that is partly to do with the changing society and hearing, and I think it's great that we're getting more visibility and role models of people throughout the organisation with different accents and having access to them to hear them. So that's fab. Antoinette, now your research has been out for a couple of months. What impact do you think it has already had on your workplace? What have you seen? And what are your hopes for what it could lead to in the future? Not only, I think, within your own organisation, but also within your sector.
Yeah. So first of all, I think echo Devyani's point about asking. It's so important that you ask people about their experiences. And I think having pieces of research like this and having I guess the information that we got from doing this research project has generated so much conversation. The research has, I found, brought people to the table in conversations about D&I who previously weren't part of the conversation, and that has been so powerful. In terms of, I suppose, the work we're doing, our D&I strategy is really focused on equity and how we can put fairness at the heart of how we operate and how people experience life in our teams. And this is on the basis that driving equity for your most marginalised communities will ultimately lead to better inclusion for everybody. So it's about understanding barriers to progression and then focusing on removing the barriers, not on fixing or changing the people. So in terms of this study, it's really helped us to think about where we should be looking for barriers, where there might be barriers for people who have certain accents, and therefore how we want to consider doing things differently as a business to start to dismantle some of these things. And I think the key takeaway here is that workplaces shouldn't be trying to bring in diverse groups of people and then attempting to crowbar them into a mold that wasn't created with them in mind. I think what the research has told us is that we should all be rethinking the systems and processes and cultures that we create and that we're asking people to operate in, and really ensuring that they're fair and they're working for everybody in the way that they should. And I suppose that leads on really to I guess, hopes for the future. I think there's still very much this perception or this belief that polish equates to performance. And I think you touched on that a little bit earlier. It's kind of a well-known, I suppose, a well-known saying in the kind of social mobility circles that polish does not equal performance. But I think we need to really start addressing that, and we really need to start unpicking that. And for us, this research was key to that. So I hope in the future, we start to realise that somebody is speaking with what we might think of as the right accent or in the right way, doesn't necessarily equate to a star performer. And actually, we need to start creating environments where people can show up as they are and as who they really are, and not be disadvantaged as a result of that.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think it's also thinking about, going back to that, it's not how you say it, it's what you say. And exactly. I think that's a mantra that we need organisations and individuals and hiring managers to think about all the time. So brilliant, thank you. I know we've got lots of questions in the Q&A, so I have a couple more for you, and then I'm going to switch over to them. So I wanted to ask you both about a comment that someone made when we advertised this event on LinkedIn. So I'm paraphrasing here, and I think, Devani, you did actually mention it slightly in your presentation, but I just want to explore it a bit more. So the gist of it is that they felt that accent bias is and I'm sort of paraphrasing and quoting here, a marginal bias, and they were happy to soften their accents to get on in business. They felt that there are bigger, worse biases and discriminations to focus on. And so given this might be, another challenge, people people we've got who are on the call might feel that they've experienced that, people, when they're saying you're discriminating against me for my accent, and people say, well, that's a marginal bias or whatever. How would you respond to those who feel like this? So Devani, I'll come to you first, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment. In a way, I think I'll start with the reasons why I would say it's not that marginal, but also maybe one detail where I would agree. As I mentioned in the talk, accent is not in addition to other forms of bias. It's the root for bias against, I think, the bigger biases that person might have in mind. So we see, just to give an example, we see outright statements about how the language of young Black East Londoners is bad in the media. So you won't see those expressed as racial bias, statements of racial bias, but they are implicitly statements of racial bias because this is the language used by an identifiable group. So I think that's quite important to recognize. And when it comes to social class, where sometimes you don't have other signals of social class, voice is often the way that people will establish that they're dealing with somebody from, a working class background. And if we're interested in social mobility, accent is usually seen as one of the primary ways that type of bias is exercised. So I think we have to see accent as a way that the other biases get perpetuated. But I also agree with the observation to some extent, because as I said, there are other things that lawyers were telling us matter more. And I think that's the positive side, where we should, what we like to do is find the evidence so that we can say, look, young people from backgrounds that are less represented, there is some accent bias, but when you speak confidently and when you know what you're talking about, you have a much bigger effect on the listener. People are not just looking to be biased against you, but they are lazy listeners. They're falling back on stereotypes. So give them something to not do that. So I agree that in a way, it's also good to think of it as maybe not the biggest bias, but I think the crucial thing is people are not aware how much they use accent as to guess at things about the person, and that's very risky. So, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I think that's a great answer. Antoinette, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would add, first of all, it's of course that person's right to feel that way if that's how they feel. For my part, I don't think that we necessarily have to choose which form of bias we're going to address to the exclusion of all others. Often in conversations about D&I, you hear people say things like a rising tide lifts all the boats. And I think that feels really true here. I think if you think, for example, if you have a focus on gender inclusion and challenging banter within your organizational culture, that will benefit a whole number of other underrepresented communities as well. Just like a focus on race and removing identifying details from CVs might also have a positive impact for people from lower socioeconomic groups if you can't tell which school or university somebody attended. So a focus on where accent bias is manifesting and seeking to address that will likely have positive impacts on lots of other groups as well. I also think it's important to note that prejudice is additive, and I think Devyani touched on that when talking about intersectionality, meaning that the kind of more intersections you sit on, the more you're going to experience forms of bias and microaggression, et cetera, and so the more your sense of belonging is going to be eroded and your psychological safety eroded. And it takes a lot of energy to change who you are, to show up at work. This effort's going to be greater still if on top of trying to code switch for your accent, you're also trying to correct for your race or your sexual orientation or your gender. So if some people feel that it's something they're able to manage, more power to them. But actually, it's a lot, and I'm not sure we should set that expectation of everybody.
No, agreed. That's brilliant. Thank you both for that answer. So I think obviously we've talked about a few solutions. There's loads of questions in the chat, so I do want to get to them. So I just wondered. So what would you say would be the top one action that leaders or those who look after this in their D&I strategy could do in the workplace to kind of, I guess, address it and address any challenges people are facing? So Antoinette, I'll come to you first.
So is that leaders or people, or a little bit of both?
What about one top action for both?
Okay. Well, I think an action for both. For both groups really is to start having this kind of conversation. I think that we know there's so much research out there, whether you're in our industry and it's the language of discrimination report, or any of the pieces that Devyani touched on. What I find time and time again, not every single time, but often, is that having a conversation about issues that previously weren't on the table changes people's level of understanding and changes people's level of awareness. And I think what we're hearing time and time again is that people aren't aware of some of these things. So using some of the tools and research available to start better conversations, I think is a really key action to take away. I would also add to people who think they're experiencing accent bias or have a non-standard or different accent to the majority group in their organisation, it can be so powerful to find a community of people around you, whether that is a network group or whoever it is, but a safe space for you to share your experiences and just build that all-important confidence in how you present it and how you speak and how you show up. Because as we've heard, it makes such a difference to how you're perceived and how you feel in the workplace.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you. Devyani.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Antoinette was saying. I wouldn't have too much to add. I would just say that when we started working with various partners, as I said, in very different sectors, we were quite pleasantly surprised to see that there's a big effect of just raising the issue, not spending lots of time, but unconscious bias training. Everyone has a kind of limit to how much they want to be doing these things. But that's why I try and emphasize the fact that a lot of people fed back to us that they just hadn't really thought about it. They hadn't spent time thinking about, the fact that when you go to the pub and you mimic your Yorkshire colleague's accent, it's not just fun, it's, reinforcing certain stereotypes, who's typical, who's not. So I think just starting the conversation, it goes a very long way. I think people very quickly realize, oh, I actually I'm relying on it so much. And at least in work context, this really leads to some risks for my people, that usually people don't want to be having those effects on each other. And so, yeah, just a mention goes a long way.
Yeah, brilliant. No, awareness, I think, is really key. And a colleague and I wrote a blog. It's on our website, so we'll share that with everyone afterwards. But this particular colleague talked about being mocked at university, which then led to sort of a lifelong fear of speaking in front of groups where her accent wasn't the majority. And I think some of that happens very early on in your career. You think that, and it has that sort of just that constant impact on you for the future as well. So I think thinking about raising the awareness that any type of so-called banter or mimicking has. So thanks for that. I'm going to ask some questions that we've got in the chat. I'm going to try and bunch up some. So I think, Devani, first of all, we've had some questions about the accent classification in your research. So I just wonder if you could clarify that.
Yeah, I completely understand where there's a few questions and where these questions are coming from. So we, the survey about labels, where we have very generic labels like Scottish, but also broken down like Glasgow, Edinburgh. It's not a great kind of survey. The reason we do it like that is 50 years ago, there was the same survey. So if we use the same labels, we can just look at whether there's been change. So actually, I agree, that these, for the first thing I talked about, general labels are not useful, but there are some breakdowns. So for instance, Swansea and Cardiff for Welsh were listed in the old study, and they show very consistently different ranks. So you get a little information from that. But there were also some questions about using terms like working class, middle class, lower, higher socioeconomic grades, and whether that continues the bias. And so there's some questions concerned about that. But I just thought it's good to clarify. So first of all, when we do, so most of our research is with audio recordings, like I showed you, not labels, which I agree are not that productive to use. But when we use audio recordings, we're usually using very detailed dialectology work, where we go around the country recording people and seeing where the voices are from. So if I say urban West Yorkshire English, that's because the features in those recordings, we always had native speakers of these accents. These were Leeds speakers who had certain features. So I think people are uncomfortable with us calling that working class, but if we want to look at social class bias, we have to find what the voice associations are. So we're not assuming that those voices are associated with that. We first record people around the country, and then we say, well, these features are bunched in this area or in this social kind of group. So we do need to be careful about that. I appreciate that general Northern English is very general, but it's something that has recently been proposed as an accent. So there was research recording people across the North, and there was a finding that there was a variety in the North that's a bit like standard varieties in the South, where you can't quite tell where in the North the person is from, more of a middle-class Northern kind of voice. So it's a proposal that's out there that there is a generic middle-class Northern accent now that's less place specific. So I appreciate all the questions about that. Industrial town is also a word that's been used from the 70s for certain accents that have seen the most aggravated bias. And again, we check that these accent features actually are self-identified with by people from certain occupational groups, for instance. So we do try and check, because we don't want to perpetuate, just assume what class is associated with.
Oh, exactly. Thank you. And someone's asked, did you also look at the use of grammar and colloquial words?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we do this work, we have to be quite careful in the design. Otherwise, too many things are mixed. So we just focused on accent because it's quite valuable to know if somebody said exactly the same thing, were they judged as less competent, which is obviously a problem. But I think definitely if we have grammar or colloquialisms, I would predict we might have even stronger reactions. So we went for standard grammar so that we give the person all the, all the chances in this mock interview recording. They're using standard English, they're using technical terms. But if we added that, we would probably see maybe even stronger reactions because of grammar. But we couldn't mix them together, otherwise we wouldn't know what's causing the reactions.
Problem. Brilliant. Thank you for that clarity. And I think that I would imagine within the research there's probably a lot of information, so people who are on the call can read some of that information at, in the appendix or whatever, in terms of how it was done, how the research was done. We've had a number of people ask questions or talk about where they've been kind of asked to lose their accent or felt that they've been discriminated against. So there's one in particular, someone said, I joined a law firm as a trainee and was told to lose my Scouse accent in order to achieve. So for anyone who's not aware, Scouse accent is around Liverpool and Merseyside. What should someone do in this situation? Antoinette, I think I'll come to you on that one, just to see if you heard that in your organisation. What advice would you give to an individual who might have come and told you that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I shouldn't be shocked, but I always find it shocking when I hear things like that people have been told so explicitly to change the way they speak. And I would always say, if you feel like you've been the victim of any kind of discrimination or harassment or bullying, to always report that. But day to day, that isn't really how we experience life at work, is it? Day to day, we don't think, I'm going to go to HR about this. But I think that there are things that I would advise people from any kind of underrepresented community, and that includes if you've got a non-standard accent. I would always be asking for feedback on things and be asking for really clear feedback on things, on whether it's pieces of work or your performance, and be very specific about what you're asking for feedback on, and don't be afraid to challenge. If you think a piece of feedback is biased or is based on something that is a characteristic as opposed to your performance, don't be afraid to gently challenge that. And I think that's, again, the power of pieces of research like this, because it gives us all a common language to use and a shared understanding of what we mean by accent bias, which hopefully empowers people to be able to better recognise when they've been a victim of, but also feel more able to call it out. And I think asking for feedback on very specific things and challenging feedback that you think might be biased is a really good way to hopefully get ahead of some of these kinds of experiences.
Brilliant, that's great advice. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to run through a few others. So, Devani, how much does your own class background influence your accent bias? Did any of the research findings show that?
We did find that it was kind of a complicated result pattern. In the South, people from higher social classes measured by education, occupation, income in our surveys showed more bias. So it was there was an effect of having being in a higher socio-economic group, but especially in the South, which is also interesting because it shows that, and we find this in many different ways when we look at language and accent attitudes, that in the North, even people who are from higher socioeconomic groups might have a personal experience that has made them less judgmental based on accent. So it was specifically in the South that there was an effect of the person's own class on how much bias they showed.
Wow, that's really fascinating, isn't it? I think so. Someone else has asked, the focus of the session's been primarily on the diversity of the UK accents. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence as to how accents of people who speak English as a second language may experience in the workplace?
Should I just briefly respond? That's a great question. Again, for feasibility reasons, we focused on British accents. We have some evidence from our work of bias against second language accents. It's quite complex because sometimes you get a little bit of a discount if you're not a native speaker. That can happen, especially European accents, Europeans who use English might just be put outside the system, whereas the groups that I talked about are almost judged for not accommodating better to a more standard voice. But you might remember in the beginning, I mentioned that French accented English tended to be high ranked. It's associated with prestige, whereas Indian accents, Caribbean accents, African accents, and these are all places where English has a long history. These are accents that are well established in the world. So they're not really non-native accents. They are native speakers of English very often, but we find in many sectors, so even we've looked a little bit in the sector of health, so doctors, for instance, where there's bias against those for foreign accents. So we see a kind of hierarchy even for foreign accents, where certain accents are not on the receiving end as much as others, not heard as unintelligible. Intelligibility is a very interesting detail, because sometimes so look at, for instance, we've had a French accented person who might be hard to understand, or I'd mentioned the Nigerian NHS worker that I spoke to, who said that, who was actually not hard to understand, but was constantly told that he was. So like there's a lot in your expectation, your willingness with different foreign accents. So there's a kind of hierarchy there as well.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And it's really sad to hear, isn't it? But obviously, I guess with the same of what we talk about UK accents, the more we raise awareness of the issues and look to how organisations can raise that awareness amongst their employees, then the more we can do to change that. So I think we're sort of out of time, sadly, so could go on forever. But so I just want to thank you both for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your insights. We will, of course, have a look at some of the questions that we've not been able to answer, and if we can, we'll answer them for those individuals if they've not posted anonymously. I'm just going to share a final couple of slides. So if we've got a couple more sessions coming up, employer sessions. So we've got Tuesday the 16th of May. We'll be joined by Bupa, Career Ready, and BIT, who's a small business recruitment business based in Glasgow. We're going to talk about outreach and social mobility. On that slide there, you'll see an external event where we're speaking as well, which people can join if they want to. And we're also going to continue this conversation around talking about class in the workplace. So we're going to run a session in July, early July, on Let's Talk About Class in the workplace. So you can visit our website there to find out more information on both of those. And then also, we've mentioned some of our resources. There's a Let's Talk About Class resource. There's a building blocks I think someone put in the Q&A, how can you build a diverse workforce? Have a look at that, and that will give you some pointers in terms of how to get started. And then we've also got various toolkits, and of course the Navigating the Labyrinth report that Devani mentioned earlier as well. So just like to thank you all for joining, and my thanks again to both Antoinette and Devani for sharing their insights.